It's nice to get to speak with you again.
Good to speak with you today, too. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you for coming on. So I guess I'll just jump right into the questions. So your art form started with composing and painting. What led you to poetry specifically?
Uh, what got me into poetry? About 2009, my wife, Louisa, who is also a poet, decided she didn't want to be a lawyer anymore and she wanted to be a writer. She wanted to be a fiction writer. So she went back to school for that at SCSU. Southern Connecticut State University,
Mhm.
but all the fiction classes were full. The only thing
Oh,
open was a poetry class, and so she took that. I knew that for some reason. I knew that was the right class for her. She's always been a words person, and she got hooked. And what happened was she would come home and she would show me drafts of her poems and ask me what I thought about them. I had no idea what to say. So I figured if I studied on my own, I had never taken a poetry class in my life. And I had never been in a workshop. So I thought if I studied on my own, I would and start writing on my own, I would eventually be able to give her some kind of reasonable feedback. Also, at this time, she would take me to all these poetry readings, which I had never been to before. And after all of that inspiration, how could you not go home and try to write something of your own? So that's how I got started around 2010. Um, when Luis and I got married 25 years ago, neither one of us had poetry on our radar. So it's something that we've fallen into together. Well, really, Luisa leading the way and me following. And it's been a great joy to us to share that adventure together.
that's amazing. Would you say that bouncing your poetry ideas sort of off of your wife helped you to be more confident in publishing the work and putting it out into the
Oh,
world?
absolutely, absolutely. Luisa was my first teacher. We would spend time talking about poetry, talking about works, um, giving feedback on each other's poems, and we still do that. She's my first reader. I'm her first reader, um, and it works out. It works out super well.
Yeah, that's true. Kind of shifting to talking more about your painting and everything. A
hmm
lot of your work, even in the collection Common Grace, sort of talks about painting. Do the two forms ever combine for you, the poetry and the painting?
Um, do they combine? Um, I think they certainly feed off of each other. They certainly inform each other. I think because I was a painter first, my process in poetry writing is very similar to the way I paint. Um, has anything materialized between the two? Not very much. I kind of keep them separate. I do have one new poem that is an ekphrastic poem based on one of my works, but that's sort of rare, at least up to this point. I don't know what the future holds. I might do some more of that. In fact, I do have an idea for a chapbook where I would like to combine the two. It's a little tricky because I want to do something a little different. Um, where the paintings are not exactly ekphrastic and the poems aren't exactly about the paintings, but they somehow flow one into the other. Difficult to explain, but that's an idea that's in the back of my mind, back of my head that I'm thinking about doing. Um, but yeah, I think up to this point, I've kept them separately. And there's an advantage to that. Um, while all creative processes inform each other, when I get stuck with poetry, I could always turn to painting. When I get stuck in the painting, I could always turn to poetry. It's like going from
Right.
one end of the room to the other, and you know, the two don't meet, but they do. I'm sure they do in some way.
Right, that makes sense. And the chapbook sounds amazing. I hope you get to explore that more.
Thank you. I will. I
You're
will.
welcome. I actually wanted to ask about how you choose because you use very concrete images in your poetry that sort of
Mhm.
help to ground the poetry. What helps you choose those images and where do you think that inspiration comes from?
I'm a very visual person, and having been a painter first, image is so important to me. So when I'm writing, I'm constantly consciously thinking of image and also sound. I used to be a musician. I no longer do that, but I used to be a musician. So sound is very important to me. So so I'm thinking in terms of images. I'm thinking in terms of what can I construct for the reader in to create an experience in terms of images where the reader could step into and feel and think for themselves rather than telling them, you should feel sad, you should feel happy. I want to create a little stage for them to walk onto and experience for themselves.
It really is effective in placing you within the poetry. Kind of talking about your most recent collection, Common Grace, it
Mm-hmm.
focuses on a lot of difficult topics like loss and family. What was that like for you to explore?
That's a great question. Yeah, the a lot of the book, the middle section of the book, specifically, is about my parents. It touches off on their experiences of World War II, um, of getting married, of being parents, of settling in Northern California suburbia, and finally, it's mostly about them growing old and dying. Um, that's probably the most profound experience that I've ever had, losing both parents. um, and it was wonderful to write about. It's very, um, I suppose, in a way, it helped me deal with grief.
Mm,
uh, my, my grief was not filled with regret concerning my parents. I had wonderful parents, and I was able to be there for both of them, when they
mm,
passed away, right there with them,
right.
which was such a gift. But still, there's some things that you want to process. And I think my poems about my parents, losing my parents, are more of a celebration of them, and an effort to keep them alive in my life. My
Mm,
parents lived on the West Coast in California, Santa Rosa, if you know where that is. It's 53 miles north of San Francisco, and I've lived here on the East Coast for many years. So we've been separated by the whole country. So it's almost like they're not gone. When I
right.
write about them, it's like they're still alive. So
Yeah.
it's really kind of nice to be able to write about them, and I'm still writing about them even after my book Common Grace was finished. Um, to keep them alive, to honor them. So it was a very healing experience. Um,
Mm,
my For some reason, it was a lot easier for me to write about my father. The poems about my father came very soon after he passed away, even while he was sick, which wasn't very long. He was sick for maybe a month before he passed
oh,
away.
wow.
But I started writing about him. But we weren't as close as my mother and me, and it took a little while for me to start writing about that.
That makes sense. I was actually going to ask, what was it like for you to move from California to Connecticut? Was it a difficult move, and how did that sort of feel with everything going on?
So I moved to the East Coast in 1987 when I did my first round of grad work. As I mentioned, I was a musician. I
Mm,
was an orchestral percussionist. So I did my undergrad at the conservatory in San Francisco. And then in 87, I moved to do my grad work in New York City. And then after I graduated, I never went back, except for the 7 months that I took care of my mother before she passed away in 2015. Um, I don't, people ask me all the time, do you miss California?
Yeah.
I don't. I really
Uh,
like the East Coast, and I feel like this is home for me. Um, and I haven't been back to California since 2015, since my mother passed away.
well,
Um,
okay.
yeah.
I totally get what you're saying about that sort of separation and it almost feeling like they're still there. I lost my grandmother last year, and
Oh,
sometimes it's weird because I rarely saw her, so you do kind of forget when you
right.
have big gaps in between. So I get what you're saying. Were there any specific memories or moments that inspired you to start writing Common Grace? Like, was there any sort of aha moment with that?
Common Grace, it wasn't a project book where I sat down and said, okay, I'm going to write 65 poems about this and this and this. It was more, it's a selection of poems that I've written over the last 10 years or so. And it just so happened that I, of course, wrote a lot about my parents. I wrote a lot about my wife, Louisa, who is all, as I mentioned before, is also a poet, and the life we've built together, and other things like my art life you mentioned, as a painter.
Mm,
Um, in another book that I'm working on, I'm writing a lot of poems about my experiences as a musician. Um,
that's awesome.
and so that might be a chapbook first, but I want to include that in my second manuscript. So these poems, are a selection of things that I've written. So there was no really one aha moment that set off Common Grace. It was just a collection of, it just organically grew.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. What was it like for you since the pieces came from so many different time periods to kind of combine it into the sections that you did and compile that?
Yeah. The sections just, there's three sections in the book, and they just came together naturally, the big
Yeah.
clumps of themes. But yeah, over a period of 10 years, my poetry has grown. And so it was a little difficult. I had a lot of revising to do, from older poems. And then I eventually wrote a few additional poems just to fill things out, to balance out the sections. Um, but yeah, that's, since I haven't been writing that long, maybe about 10 years seriously, 6 years seriously, I would say. Yeah, it was. This first manuscript was a little rocky to put together. Um, I think it'll be smoother for the next book, because I've kind of evened out. I haven't been, you know,
Yeah.
going up the growth curve.
Well, it reads beautifully and not
Thank
rocky at
you.
all. You're
Thank
welcome.
you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed reading it. It's beautiful. Was it a difficult decision for you to put Common Grace out into the world, or had you kind of made peace with a lot of the poems since they were spread out over the years? What was that like?
That's that's such a great question. Wow, that's such a great question. I could answer that in so many ways. First, I'll say what comes to mind is, I'm such a huge introvert and such a private person, and so many of these poems are terribly personal. So that's one aspect that makes it difficult to stick it out there. But I kind of separate myself from my poems once they're written or once they're put into book form and
Hmm.
put it out there. It's like, oh yeah, that's not me. That's those are just poems that I wrote, and you know, I kind of try to deal with it in that way, which is kind of denial, I guess. Um, but I wanted to write, since about 2017, I decided to pursue poetry seriously. Got myself a mentor who really taught me so much. As I mentioned, I never had a poetry class in school, in college, and I was never in a workshop up until that point. And so I got a mentor through the AWP Writer to Writer program, Matthew Thornburn. was my mentor and continues to be my mentor, and a good friend. He taught me so much, so much. He brought me to a level where I felt comfortable applying for MFA programs.
Hmm.
So that was 2017 when I started to take poetry really seriously, wanted to pursue it as a direction in my life. And from that point, I knew pretty much I wanted to have a book,
Right.
at least one book. And it's hard coming to something so later in life. People my age have like 8, 9, 10 books out already, and so you're kind of feeling like you're playing catch up, especially if you're serious about it. I'm very serious about pursuing this as an art. It's not just a hobby for me. So it's important for me to put that book out. If I were a younger man, if I were in my 20s, like a lot of my cohort mates in my MFA program, I probably would have waited a little longer to put it out, so my writing, I felt like, my writing would mature a little more. But, I'm kind of getting up there, and I thought it would be really nice to, get a book out. And so when the opportunity arose, I grabbed it, with great appreciation and gratitude. And I am so grateful to all the people involved. Nobody does it alone, right?
Yeah.
One book, one author, but there are so many people behind giving me feedback. The my press, Beacon Press, that their amazing team, my amazing editor, Catherine Tung, as well as Matthew, who I mentioned, my wife, and so many others who have contributed to this book.
There's certainly not one linear path to becoming a writer and putting your creativity out there. So I'm glad that you were able to do that, even if it was later than you would have liked. What was it like getting to be published with Beacon Press? That's quite an accomplishment.
It was amazing. Yeah, it was. You know, I, there are so many talented, deserving people out there. A lot of it is just right place, right time. You know,
Mhm.
um, so I'm very fortunate, and I know this, and I I'm so grateful for that opportunity. It's just been an amazing experience. And the team at Beacon Press, and again, I'm going to mention my editor, Catherine Tung. um, they've been so amazing. They love what they do, and they're good at it, and I've had such a good experience there. Um, I also have a chapbook out that came before the full length. It's Ubasute, and that was produced by Slappering Hall Press. Um, and that press too, I feel so fortunate to have had my chapbook published by them. Working with them, being associated with them, really kind of, pushed me forward.
Right. I was actually going to ask about your first chapbook because it goes by the same name of one of the sections of Common Grace.
Yeah.
What was it like sort of expanding that idea into a longer form section, and what sort of inspired that first chapbook?
Well, the first chapbook is about my parents. It's, and as I explained before, it's mostly about them growing old and dying, but it covers more than that. Um, the reason why I wrote the chapbook was there's a poem in there called Burial, and maybe I could read that later, where I say that my father wrote in a letter to my sister and me that he didn't want a funeral, he didn't want a
Mm.
memorial service, he didn't want an obituary in the newspaper. And that was his wish. And so we wanted to honor that. But at the same time, I thought, oh my God, how sad that is. Because if you don't have an obituary in the newspaper, which eventually gets put online, nobody's
Yeah.
going to know you existed. So I thought to
Right.
myself, why don't I write some poems about my parents, um, with the intention of getting them published, of putting them into a book, getting it published? That way I could honor their wishes. I didn't have a memorial service. I
Right.
didn't put their obituary in the newspaper, but yet writing these poems about them and dedicating the book to them, which I named them specifically in the book at the, in the title page, in the dedication page, people will know they existed and how wonderful they were. So that's what inspired the chapbook. And I was very fortunate to have, won the Slapping Hall contest and get that book published. And they made this gorgeous book out of it, designed by a gentleman named Ed Rayer of Swamp Press, and that's in Massachusetts. He just built this beautiful book around the poems, and then expanding it. I knew that I wanted that part of the full length, but the chapbook, the prize, the requirements were for 20 poems. Okay. And so I whittled that manuscript down to 20 poems. They did ask me at the end if I wanted to add anything to it, but I was so in love with this 20 poem thing that we had built together that I didn't want to add anything. I thought, okay, I could add something for my book. So I did add other poems. And then I think I took one poem out of the chapbook and put it into the third section, just to sort of tie the sections, the second and third section together. And hopefully, there are things in the first section of that book that also tie. I do mention my parents in the first section. So there's some kind of continuity there. But yeah, I'm glad I had the opportunity to expand it. Yeah.
That's wonderful that you were able to honor your parents in that way. In one of the earlier poems at the start of Coming Grace, you talk about your parents and you kind of walked in on them having affection towards each other, which was rare. Given that you grew up sort of in that environment, what was it like for you to be so emotionally vulnerable in your work?
Yeah, that's funny. Whenever I think about that moment, I still cringe. So, so weird. It's like, yeah, I grew up in a Japanese American home. My father was Japanese American, born in the United States, but his family, they weren't very physically or verbally affectionate. And my mother was also born in the United States, but was raised in Japan, and definitely not physically or verbally affectionate. So yeah, seeing this thing where my parents were like in an embrace was so incredibly shocking and weird for me. And yeah, but I'm more verbal,
Verbal.
and slightly more physically affectionate, even though that's not my top love language. I am a little freer in those than my parents. And yeah, it's good to express, it's very helpful to express all that. And it also gives the reader some sort of background on where I'm coming from. I try hard not to be too sentimental in my writing. I know it creeps in there a lot, because I am a extremely emotional, sensitive person. But when I write, I try to sort of back off as much as I can, just to present the experience and let the writer, the reader experience that for themselves.
It comes across in such a genuine and organic way.
Thank you.
Sure. You're welcome. Throughout the collection, you also featured sort of moments with strangers that were around you. You talked about the cold and a conversation with a man in New York. How did those moments with strangers sort of tie into the collection for you?
How did they tie into the collection? That's a good question. I don't know if I could answer that. People are a part of life, and I wanted to include a variety of things, not just interactions with my parents or my wife, but I guess I wanted the reader to be surprised. And one way to do that is to bring in another character,
Right.
Yeah.
It really helps to tie it together and sort of speak to the human connection of being alive, so it reads very nicely.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Is there a favorite form that you sort of gravitated towards? I noticed in a lot of the poems the words were spaced out on the actual page itself.
Mhm.
And what was it like for you to play with those forms?
I love playing with the structure of the poem. Um, I don't know if I have a favorite to gravitate toward. It all depends on the poem itself. What the poem is demanding. Um, Sometimes it demands to be lineated. Sometimes you want to challenge yourself to concentrate it into a sonnet. Sometimes I do away with punctuation and capitalization and use inline gaps. It really depends on how I'm feeling about the poem at the moment I write it. There might be some poems in there that if I were to write them today, I might not do it in that way.
Right,
But I also find that trying your poem in different forms helps you to edit it. Like if you start out with a prose poem and you think, maybe this would be better lineated, and then you start lineating it, then you say, oh my gosh, I don't need that word. That's an extra word. You could take it out. That happens to me when I'm playing with forms or thinking, oh, I really need to say that differently because of the line break. Whether or not I keep it lineated or go back to the prose poem,
right.
it makes it tighter. And I'm into very tight poems. I like very economical use of language. That's what appeals to me.
Right. Were there any poems in Common Grace that you sat on longer than others or that took you longer to be happy with?
Yeah, definitely. You always dream of those moments, right? As when you're writing, as you probably know, that poems that write themselves that come to you,
Yeah,
and then they do, and it's done. And you show it to your friends, and they said, "Oh my God, it's the greatest thing you've ever written." And it's like, great. And then you try to do that again, and it takes you a couple months, maybe a year to
right,
finish it. Yeah, there are, and I'm not sure I could point them out. But yeah, there are a lot of poems that I've sat on and tried to rework and just didn't happen for a long time. But I think that's it with everybody. That's how
yeah.
it goes. Yeah.
I know for me, when I'm writing poetry, it sort of comes out, and sometimes I'll never touch the poem again. I'll leave it in its original state, and that's kind of how I want to keep it. Do you prefer that, or do you prefer kind of reworking it and getting it into a place where you're more happy with the revision?
Gosh, that's hard to say because sometimes when I take a poem and I'm happy with it, I send it out for publication, it gets published, and then I put it into the book. Um, After reading it, a lot of times at readings, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I should have, I should have done this or done that. So I don't know. It's, you know, I would love it if I could just write something, be happy with it, and it's in its best form, and I could say goodbye and then go on to the next one. That's the best situation for me. But it doesn't always happen that way. Um,
Right,
with a painting, it's different. It's like once it's sold, it's sold. You can't do
right,
anything to it, and so that's kind of nice that there's a cap on it. It's a mark in time. That's a record in time, and I guess that's how I try to treat the poems too. Like all these poems in Common Grace, I try not to um, do anything to them. Um, their record in time, and I'm just going to go on and write better poems. Now that being said, the last reading I did where you were there
yeah,
attending that reading, I did read one poem where I took out a little phrase.
that's it.
I'm not going to tell you which one that is. You might
Uh,
you might you might find it and you might remember it, but I did do that, and I think it's much better without that phrase.
Kind of transitioning to talking about your experience as a Japanese American, in one of the
Mhm.
poems in Common Grace, you have this moment where you're pulling food out of the oven and you sort of start speaking in Japanese. What is it like for you when those moments of childhood kind of pop up in mysterious ways that you don't expect?
Oh, it's so weird. It's and it's very humorous. It's yeah, I don't speak Japanese. My mother tried to teach me, but my sister and I were the only Asians in our elementary school. Um, Certainly in my class, I was the only Asian, and so it's very difficult. You want to be accepted, you don't want to be different. Also, for some reason, foreign languages are not easy for me to learn.
Mhm.
Um, I've tried learning Japanese since then, and it's very difficult. But yeah, there are words that we used to use in our house. Our house was a mix, was English. Everyone spoke English, but there were little words here and there in Japanese that were thrown in just naturally. You know, what do we need? Forks and knives, ohashi. Yeah,
Yeah.
ohashi means chopsticks. Um, that we would just throw in there. So yeah, when they pop out, things that I haven't thought of in a long time. And then in that poem, I mentioned that I couldn't think of the English. I couldn't think of chopsticks
Yeah.
to tell my wife, I need chopsticks. I just
Yeah.
kept on screaming ohashi, ohashi, which was quite funny.
You mentioned struggling in school. Was drawing an outlet for you during that time? I know you mentioned drawing in one of the poems during school.
Yeah, yeah, that was. I've always drawn and doodled, and
Mm.
I've always made things. I consider myself a maker, which is interesting because the Greek word for uh, for poet, the root of the Greek word translates into maker. So a
Oh,
poet is a maker. Um, so I do consider myself, even though I paint, I'm still a maker. I make paintings. It best describes my process. I make poems. That best describes my process.
I never knew that translation. That's cool. You taught me something new today.
I think I learned that from Ezra Pound in one of his books.
You also talked about Japan and the war. Your mother was a healthcare worker during that time, right? What was it like to explore those themes and kind of connect to that?
She was actually not a nurse until way after the war. She was a young teenager during the war, which is very frightening. She lived in Tokyo where they firebombed. So she and her family, along with so many other people in Tokyo, were running from the fires and the
Mhm.
bombs. And um, she, yeah, she wasn't a nurse until the 50s. Yeah. Um, I'm sorry. Can you repeat your question one more time?
I asked about what it was like for you to sort of connect to writing about the war and what that meant for you.
Okay. Um, I've never experienced war myself, of course. I was always scared as a little kid of
Mm.
growing up and being drafted into Vietnam. But I think considering World War II, what my parents went through, my father in the internment camps here in the United States, my mother running from fire bombs in Tokyo, it really helped me to appreciate what they went through. I mean, where they had come from,
Right.
and what they had accomplished in their lives, overcoming those difficulties. Um, and yeah, in some way, I think I must feel the effects of the war in some
Mm.
way. Um, I mean, just through racism, which was, I mean, racism was always there,
Right.
against, Chinese, against Japanese in this country. But I think it was really magnified by the war. Um, the enemy, like I grew up being called things like, Jap, Gook, yellow devil, things like that.
Right. You mentioned also going through a box of your mother's memories. Did that tangibility help you to connect to her as well when you were writing?
Yeah, it did. um I keep my mother's stuff in the basement, my father's stuff as well. um it's nice to have, even though I'm not always looking through it, it's nice to have their stuff down there. um and especially the pictures, the old pictures of my parents before I was born, really helps me to consider them as people.
Right,
When you have a mother and father, they're not really they're not really people. They're mommy and daddy, which is,
right,
and to think that my mother was once, you know young like me. Well, I'm not young anymore, but when I was 29, to think what she was doing when she was 29, and then what I was doing when I was 29. Yeah, it's amazing to um, think about them. Would we have been friends, if we
yeah.
grew up together? I don't know. Um, yes. So yes, it does connect me to them. It helps. Yeah.
You also, through this exploration in the collection, kind of towards the end, explore your own mortality. What was that like, and sort of coming to terms with that?
Yeah. When you have people close to you passing away, you can't help but, we all know that it's going to happen to us.
Right,
There's no way that we are not going to die. Um, we don't like to think about it, um, but I don't mind thinking about it. Um, I know it's coming, and I want to make sure that my life is as full as it is, now. Um, and just learning from other people, learning from my parents to make that life full. Um, and I think also considering my mortality just makes me appreciate what I do have now,
right,
um, and the contentment I have, and how it's not about money. I mean, obviously, I'm a poet, right? It's not about the money.
right.
Um, and, you know, so
In a
yes.
in a way, the talk of the mortality kind of helps to celebrate life more because it kind of allows you that appreciation. Would you say that it helped your view on life to evolve overall?
I think everything helps. Yeah. I mean, it's all life, right? Even death is a part of life, and just going through that with my parents, um, it gives you, or it should, or hopefully would give you a better perspective on
Right,
life and your own life and other people, what's important, what's not. Yeah.
right. Talking about your dad specifically,
Mhm.
a lot of your imagery is also centered around nature. Do you feel that
Mhm.
he inspired that at all? I know there's a lot of talks about him kind of in the yard and
Yeah.
all of that.
Yeah, my dad was born on a farm in San Gabriel, California. He told me that his parents, that his father sired all his brothers and sisters in order to work the farm. He was a farm boy at heart. He became a physical therapist by profession, but all his free time was divided between either fishing or gardening. Um, he had the touch. He was so good about our backyard. We had a tract home in Santa Rosa, not a big plot of land. It was fenced in, but
Mhm.
half of it was Japanese garden. He created this Japanese garden with these bamboo screens and wisteria. It was gorgeous. And then the other half sort of over time evolved. Once it had some fruit trees in it, then it became an area of swimming pool, so he could teach me how to swim, my sister how to swim. Then it became a vegetable garden, and in the end, it became again fruit trees when they died. Um, he loved being outside and outdoors. I'm not so outdoorsy and I'm not so good with the garden, but I appreciate it so much. And so, yes, in answer to your question, yeah,
Right.
yeah, I believe, yeah, he did help me to appreciate that.
Throughout the collection, you also feature very specific memories, like a time that a fishbone got stuck in your throat or a needle going into your eye. What kind of
Mhm.
made you choose those specific moments?
I think I wanted to introduce a little humor
Mm,
um, into the collection. The second section is a little heavy, with my
yeah,
parents' death, and I wanted to give the reader variety and breadth.
right.
So yeah, I think I chose those things. True things, I did get a fishbone stuck in my throat when I was a kid, very little kid. Um, and I still get injections in my eyeball.
There you
Not so humorous when
no,
I get when I get them, but
I'd
the
imagine.
but yeah, talking about it is kind of funny, especially that incident in that poem happened while I was doing my MFA in Boston. So it was terrible having this eye full of blood and having to go to school. I wore my dark glasses and I'd have to tell my professors, please let me keep my. You don't want to see this.
I can't
Um,
imagine.
yeah.
Your last section of the book centers around your relationship with your wife, Louisa, and it
Yes.
sort of feels like a foil to the rest of the collection. It brings a lot of light in. What was it like for you to kind of create that section of the book?
That's kind of the joyful section. I mean, even though there are some hard poems in there, especially about uh, an incident that happened in Louisa's past about the man grabbing her and threatening her life,
Right.
about my mother-in-law who had Alzheimer's. Um, but you can't have one without the other. Life is full of hard things and joyful things. Um, it was nice to end the book that way,
Right.
on a kind of a glimmer of hope. Um, you know, all these things considered in the first section, second section, this is where I am today.
I think you
Um,
do a beautiful job of balancing that tension with those darker moments and then bringing in the light. It's amazing to read.
thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. You recently published a couple of poems. One was about your mother that was published online, and then one sort of talks about this grocery store trip. What has it been like for you to publish those new pieces outside of your collections?
Oh, so grateful. I am so grateful. You're talking about the poem in Salamander and the one in Lunch Ticket.
Yes.
Um, the one in Lunch Ticket is the Scrub Jay about my mother, another poem about my mother. Um, and the one in Salamander is the one about sitting in the grocery store, the Whole Foods parking lot, remembering my mother. Um, yeah, first of all, so grateful to these journals for publishing my work and the editors who chose to give them a good home. Um, yeah, I love that there's life after book.
Hmm.
It's like
Yeah.
so many times you write a book and it's like, okay, now what? I hear that
Yeah.
from people. It's like I forget how to write a poem.
Mm.
For me, the best part of pursuing poetry or painting is the process, is the making. So I never stop writing or painting.
Right.
Even though the book was, I'm glad that's done, and it's nice to have that. I mean, it's great. It's great to have that. It's more than nice. I'm so grateful for the two books that I have, the chapbook and the full length. Um, but the real joy is the making, is the
Right.
writing, and I'm still glad that there's an audience for what I'm doing right now.
Right. What is it like for you doing the readings and bearing it to the world in person?
Um, you know, I that's it's difficult for me because I do like doing readings. I like sharing my work. I like getting my work out there. I like how responsive the audiences are to my work. Um, However, as I said, I'm a huge introvert. So I think I'm at my happiest when I'm in my studio alone, writing or painting. Um, but I can't do without the readings.
Right,
I do like that. I do enjoy that. It is as it is a little strange sharing things that are so personal with people, but I kind of, as I mentioned before, kind of separate myself when I'm reading my poems. I don't. I kind of pretend like they're subconsciously like they're not my poems. They're not my life. You
right,
know, I think some of those poems about my parents, if I really did think about them, I probably couldn't get through the poem, because they are very, you know, there is a sadness there.
right.
Uh, yeah.
I have two more questions for you. I know it's been a lot of questions. I apologize, but
Such good questions. Thank you.
thank you. What advice would you give to poets who want to start putting work out into the world but are kind of afraid to do so?
Okay. Okay. What you do, nobody could do this alone. You need to find some trusted readers, people who know you, who know your work, who know what you are trying to do, and get another set of eyes on your work, or a few sets of eyes on your work. And have them help you shape your work,
Mm,
and or to clarify to yourself what it is you want to do and what you're trying to do. And then just take a deep breath and get it out there, get it out there. Cover letters don't need to be complicated. Just make sure you read all the guidelines, what they want, and make sure your poems look neat and all in a Times Roman font, 12 points. Um, yeah, and best of luck and congratulations on the courage to send it out. It's not an easy thing, at first to send your
it's
work
not
out because you tend to take rejections really super personally, which you shouldn't.
right.
It's hard not to, and I know I'm saying this. I'm probably preaching to myself, but I submit a lot.
Mm.
It for me. I'm not a gambler, but for me, it's like playing the lottery. It's
It it really is. Chill Subs even has like a bingo card of rejections that you can kind of
oh
play.
really?
Yeah. I just started sending my work out, so that was great advice.
Oh, good for you.
Thank you. I have one last question that's music related. So
Yep.
in Common Grace, you mentioned Joni Mitchell and Stevie Nicks. Are there any other artists that stick out to you or particular songs that kind of defined your childhood and adulthood?
That's such a great question. There are so many, you know, there are so many artists. And I listen to these artists when I'm painting, not when I'm writing. I can't listen to music when I'm writing because I think
Right.
the poetry has its own music and it has its own words. Um, Joni Mitchell, Stevie Nicks. I like James Taylor,
Nice.
uh, Carly Simon. Really kind of 70s
Yeah.
70s music. But I also like Gary Burton, the vibraphonist. Um, I don't believe he's playing anymore, but I do listen to his recordings. Chick Corea, Gary Burton. Um, I listen to a lot of different things. I think the tie with my past, though, is more with particular songs than it is
Mm,
with an artist's body of work. Joni is special. It's like,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's like I want to be. you know, I mean,
Yeah.
she's a poet and a painter. you know,
Absolutely.
you know,
Yeah.
and so so authentic, so honest, and so, this is who I am. This, what you see is what you get. And I love that about any kind of artist, doing their own thing no matter what's going on around them, what's popular, what's not.
Right.
Yeah.
I know we only have about 10 minutes left of the hour, but if you would like to read a couple of poems, I want to give you the floor.
Sure. I would love to read a couple poems. And since we talked so much about my parents, I'm going to read this poem, which I enjoy reading. This is, and I believe I read this at the reading you were at. It's a Malaysian pantoum. And a pantoum is a form that has a specific scheme of repetition. So there are lines that repeat throughout the work. And this poem is entitled Burial. I need to change glasses here. Burial. I return my father's body to the earth, cremated as he instructed in a letter. No funeral, no obituary in the newspaper. Those who needed to know were told. I had his remains cremated as he instructed, scattered his ashes in Bodega Bay. Those who needed to know were told that I waited until my mother passed to scatter his ashes in Bodega Bay, past the jetty where we used to fish. I waited until my mother passed, poured out their dust together, past the jetty where we used to fish. From the deck of the Miss Anita, seagulls calling overhead. I poured out their dust together with a handful of Uncle George. From the deck of the Miss Anita, seagulls calling overhead. No funeral, no obituary in the newspaper. With a handful of Uncle George, I returned their bodies to the earth. Let's see. Do we have time for two more poems?
You should, yeah.
Okay, so I'll read two more poems. And again, about my parents. This is, I mentioned that my father was in the internment camps and my mother was in Tokyo dodging fire bombs. This poem is about my parents when they first got married, before my sister and I came along. And it's entitled The Hardest Part. The fire truck siren downstairs raided the air of my mother's dreams. She'd scream in her sleep, my father told me, even after we married. More than a decade past the Second World War. For him, American concentration camps. For her, the firebombing of Tokyo. They moved into a San Francisco apartment that rented to Japs. A one-bedroom walk-up above the Post Street fire station. They painted their bathroom black. It was in style then. Shelved books, unboxed a new rice cooker, watered a shrub of Japanese maple potted for their future garden. When the station got a call in the middle of the night, the rumble of the overhead door crumbled into the wreck that was once her home. Swirling lights flashed ancient trees into flames through the thin silk curtains of her eyelids. No warning, no drill, no cover. My father stilled her body, his broad hand on her shoulder or hip as they lay in the dark, listening to the slowing of her breath. The hardest part of those nights, he said, was waiting sometimes hours, for the truck and the men to come back. And the last poem I will read for you is about my mother, and this is entitled Afternoon Infusion, with a cameo from Stevie Nicks. Afternoon Infusion. She panics 3 hellos, as if startled by the noise of an empty house. Calls from St. Joseph's. The nurses are slow to start her hydration. I'm at a bar. Stevie Nicks reverbs in my beer, lures me back to the edge of 17 in this town I left 30 years ago. I take her call outside, stand away from the smokers. Half truth, I'm at the mall. She slurs a request, milk of magnesia, and that other thing she can't remember. But I remember when I was a boy. She told me about the mythical Japanese custom, ubasute. A grown son lifts his aged mother on his back, delivers her to a mountain, leaves her to die. I'll come pick you up after chemo, I say, and hang up, realizing she's already cradled by the mountain. The waft of cigarette smoke and hint of manure in Santa Rosa air usher me back into the restaurant. The hostess smiles, welcomes me. Clueless, I have come and gone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The way you read is so captivating, no matter how many times I've heard you read.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you so much.